Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum. Alhamdulillah nahmaduhu wa nusalli ala rasulil kareem amma ba'd. So inshallah we'll start the third lecture of this series of a comparative study of Surah Maryam and Surah Taha. I will give an outline of what we will be discussing today. So the topics to be covered today will include Prophet Zakaria alayhi salam in the Holy Quran, Prophet Yahya alayhi salam in the Holy Quran, brief overview of the New Testament, and the mention of Prophet Zakaria and Yahya alayhi salam in the New Testament. I will be quoting extensively from the Quran as well. And again, to remind the people who may be joining for the first time that this is an academic study only. So if we look at Prophet Zakaria alayhi salatu wasalam, he's mentioned 7 times in the Quran in 6 verses. We are studying Surah Maryam, and the first 15 or 16 verses of Surah Maryam are actually related to Zakaria alayhi salatu wasalam and Yahya alayhi salatu wasalam. And then the story of Maryam alayhi salatu wasalam continues. We have discussed a lot about Maryam alayhi salatu wasalam, the reason for her name, the meaning of her name, her lineage, and we will be discussing it in more detail, inshallah, next week. But today's talk will be about Zakaria alayhi salatu wasalam and Yahya alayhi salatu wasalam, who are mentioned in the first 15 or 16 verses of Surah Maryam. Now in Surah Al-Imran, ayah number 37, Zakaria alayhi salatu wasalam has been mentioned twice, and it's pretty much the same story that is covered or repeated in Surah Maryam. But Surah Maryam was revealed earlier in Makkah, and Surah Al-Imran was revealed in Medina. Ayah number 38 also mentions Zakaria alayhi salatu wasalam. There are minor differences in the story as mentioned in Surah Al-Imran and Surah Maryam. So we'll be pointing out those minor differences as well. So let's start with the ayah first. فَأَعُوذُ بِاللَّهِ مِنَ الشَّيْطَانِ الرَّجِيمِ فَتَقَبَّلَهَا رَبَّهَا بِقَبُولٍ حَسَنٍ وَأَنبَتَهَا نَبَاتًا حَسَنًا. So this is about the birth of Maryam alayhi salatu wasalam, that her mother had made a dua that the child that she was carrying in her womb will be a male, and she will dedicate him to be a muharran. Muharran means somebody who will be serving in the temple. But when she gave birth, she found that it was a daughter. And obviously she was surprised. But then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned that he accepted her in a beautiful way, and he made her grow in the most beautiful fashion. وَكَفَّلَهَا Zakaria, and Zakaria alayhi salatu wasalam became her guardian. Now the scene moves very quickly. This is a very quick imagery of the Quran. It's summarizing years and years of history. Because Maryam alayhi salatu wasalam, from the time she was born to the time she entered the temple, she was about 12 or 13 years old according to the Bible, to the biblical sources, but the Quran doesn't mention anything about it. So Quran moves very fast, and it says, "Kullama dakhala alayha Zakaria al-mihraba." So she was in the inner part of the temple serving Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and every time Zakaria alayhi salatu wasalam entered the mihrab, wajada indaha rizqan, he found near her risk sustenance. And our scholars mentioned that this was unusual sustenance. So qala ya Maryamu anna laki hadha. He said, "Oh Maryam, where do you get it from?" Qalat huwa min indillah. It is from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Inna Allah yarzuqu man yasha'u bighayri hisab. And Allah provides sustenance to whoever he wants without accountability, without counting. Now Zakaria alayhi salatu wasalam recognized that this was a very special occasion to make dua. This was a special place, this was a special person, and this was a special event. So in Islamic theology, if you read about dua, there is a section which mentions what are the special places and what are the special times where a dua is more likely to be accepted. So Zakaria alayhi salatu wasalam, to say, seize the opportunity, and hunalika da Zakaria, at there and then, Zakaria alayhi salatu wasalam made a dua to his Rabb. Qala Rabbi habli min ladunka zurriyatan tayyibatan innaka sami'ud dua. That, oh Allah, give me a gift. This word hab and its derivatives wahaba, wahabna, come several times in this surah. Oh Allah, give me a gift from yourself, a progeny that will be pure, and indeed you are the one who always listens to a dua. Next verse, which mentions Zakaria alayhi salatu wasalam, as I mentioned in Surah Maryam, at the very beginning after Kafa Ya Ain Swad, Zikru Rahmati Rabbika Abdahu Zakaria, we discussed this last week. Now, as this, I've omitted the few verses here, which basically recount the same theme as we discussed in Surah Al Imran. So now the dua is now being responded by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Ya Zakaria, inna nubashiruka bi ghulamin ismuhu Yahya, lam naj'al lahu min qablu samia. That, oh Zakaria, we give you the good tidings, the glad tidings of a son whose name will be Yahya. So what is happening here? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling him three things, in fact, four things. Lam naj'al lahu min qablu samia. First is that we have accepted your dua. Even though you are old, you have lost all hope of having a child, but we are giving you this glad news. Second, it will be a son. Third, his name will be Yahya. So Yahya alayhi salatu wasalam, at least in the Quran, is the only child who has been named by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, only person. And he said, Lam naj Allahu min qablu samia. Nobody has been named like him before. We'll discuss this in more detail. Now, Surah Anam also mentions Zakaria alayhi salatu wasalam, as well as Yahya and Isa and Ilyas. Wa Zakaria wa Yahya wa Isa wa Ilyas kullu min as-salihin. So four prophets are mentioned among the Salihin in this ayah, but the details are not given over here. And in Surah Al-Anbiya, where a lot of prophets of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala are mentioned, verse number 89 mentions, wa Zakaria idnada rabbahu rabbi la tazarni farda wa anta khairul warisin. That when Zakaria alayhi salatu wasalam called upon his Rabb and said, do not leave me alone, which means do not leave me without a waris, without an inheritor, without somebody who will inherit my knowledge. Wa anta khairul warisin, despite, although you are the best of the inheritors. So now, what does the Quran tell us about Zakaria alayhi salatu wasalam in these 7 places where Zakaria alayhi salatu wasalam has been mentioned by name? And there are other verses in Surah Maryam that we will see where he is not mentioned by name, but his zikr, his story continues. That first we know that he was Maryam alayhi salatu wasalam's guardian. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala appointed him to take care of Maryam, which also means that Maryam alayhi salatu wasalam's father was not alive at that time. We had discussed in last week that although Quran does not mention whether he was alive or not, the Quran gives us a reference, and I think it's a very clear reference that in the presence of a father, no one else will be a daughter's guardian. So the fact that Zakaria alayhi salatu wasalam was made guardian by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is because her father was not alive. Now, he had access to the temple where Maryam alayhi salatu wasalam was staying. So he was a high priest, according to the Jewish and Christian sources, who was given the responsibility of going into the temple and taking care of it. What I have read about it is that it was the Harun alayhi salatu wasalam's progeny, which was given the task of taking care of the temple. And the tribe to which Zakaria alayhi salatu wasalam belonged was the tribe of Abiyah or Abijah, which we discussed last week. Now, he was old, without a child, and his wife was barren. And he was amazed when he saw that Maryam alayhi salatu wasalam had been provided with unusual and unseasonal sustenance like fruits and vegetables and whatever else. Now, this was not a denial, it was an amazement. He was quite pleased to see such remarkable, extraordinary things being provided to Maryam alayhi salatu wasalam. And that's why, being a prophet, he recognized that this was the time to make an extraordinary dua. This was an extraordinary time. This was an extraordinary event. So this was the time to make an extraordinary dua. And he did it. So now what does Quran tell us? Continuing, he makes a prayer, but in a low voice. Nidaan khafifa, Surah Maryam mentioned, to Allah to grant him an heir. The wish was granted right away, and he was given the name of a son as well. Now, we will be discussing later on the difference between the biblical account and the account given in the Quran, which we will discuss further. But here, let's focus on the Quran. So he asked Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, not that he did not believe, he believed, but there was no pregnancy test in those days. How would he know that his wife is bearing a child? So he's asked, what will be the sign? And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said that his sign will be that he will not be able to speak for 3 days and 3 nights to people except by gestures. Now, there is a difference between Surah Al Imran and Surah Maryam. At one place it is 3 days, and other place is Salasa Layal in 3 nights. And those who criticize the Quran say that there is a contradiction over here. And it's easy to understand that you have to combine both ayahs, that his period of silence, or the period in which he would not be able to speak, was 3 days and 3 nights. Not 3 days and 2 nights or 3 nights and 2 days, but 3 days and 3 nights. He's also mentioned about the righteous people. And he and his wife, they means he is Surah Al-Anbiya, he and his wife used to race each other or compete each other in doing good and call upon us, that is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, with hope and fear. So Quran also tells us to live between two states, bain al khawf wa raja, between fear and between hope. They were totally humbling themselves before us. So this is the description of Zakaria alayhi salatu wasalam. This is the character of Zakaria alayhi salatu wasalam that is mentioned by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now, what are the differences in the account in Surah Al Imran and Surah Maryam? As I mentioned, this is a comparative study. We are not only comparing the Quranic version with the versions given in Torah and Injil, we are also comparing the different versions or different nuances in different verses of the Quran. So Surah Al Imran mentioned Talatata Ayyam, 3 days, whereas Surah Maryam mentioned Thalasa Layalin Sawiya, 3 nights. And as I mentioned, it's very easy to understand. And the Mufassir of Bahrul Muhit mentioned, وَدَلَّ ذِكْرُ اللَّيَالِ هُنَا وَالْأَيَّامِ فِي آلِ إِمْرَانَ عَلَى أَنَّ الْمَنْعَ مِنَ الْكَلَامِ اسْتَمَرَّ لَهُ ثَلَاثَةَ أَيَّامٍ بِلَيَالِهِنَّ. That if you combine the two verses from Surah Al Imran and Surah Maryam, you come to the conclusion that the uh, forbiddance of speaking lasted for 3 days and 3 nights. Now, in the Bible, it is not 3 days and 3 nights. It's actually for several months, or actually till the pregnancy finished. But Quran mentions 3 nights and 3 days. Now, the second difference between the two ayahs. So let's look at Surah Al Imran. Qala Rabbij Ali ayah. Here, Zakaria alayhi salatu wasalam himself is asking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to show him a sign, which is different from the biblical account. We have to understand that why is Quran selecting certain aspects? And the reason is that there are differences in the Quran and between what was modified or changed in the Gospels or in the Torah. So Quran is telling us the real story. So here Zakaria alayhi salatu wasalam himself is asking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for a sign, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Qala ayatuka Allah tukalliman nasa thalasata ayyamin illa ramza. That your sign is that you will not be able to speak to people for 3 days except by gestures, like sign language. And then the next command was, which basically implies it is not a punishment for you, O Zakaria. During that period, waskur rabbaka kasira. Keep remembering your Rabb a lot during this period of time, even though you're not able to speak, but remember your Rabb, which will be in your heart. وَسَبَّحْ بِالْعَشِيِّ وَالْإِبْكَارِ, and continue to glorify Him by night and day. Now, let's look at the Maryam, Surah Maryam. Qala Rabbish Ali ayah. Same as in Surah Al Imran. Qala ayatuka Allah tukalliman nas. Same wording in Surah Al Imran. But here the difference, Thalasa layalin sawiya. 3 nights completely. This is one explanation. The other explanation is Thalasa layalin, 3 nights, sawiyan, while in a state that you are physically okay, which means that the ability to speak has been taken away by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, not as a result of a stroke, which causes, as Dr. Ramdan might be listening, or a neurologist, aphasia, in which a person is not able to speak because his speech area has been affected by the stroke. So sawiya means that you have not sustained any anatomical damage. It is from us, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala saying that you will not be able to speak for a short period of time, which will tell you that your wife is now pregnant. So now what does Zakaria alayhi salatu wasalam do? He does not complain to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He doesn't cry, why am I not able to speak? He goes out, فَخَرَجَ عَلَىٰ قَوْمِهِ مِنَ الْمِحْرَابِ. So he comes out of the mihrab and reaches his community, فَأَوْحَى إِلَيْهِمْ. He gestures to them. He does not speak. So one other meaning of the word wahi is not just revelation, it's also to tell someone by way of gesture. فَأَوْحَى إِلَيْهِمْ أَنْ سَبِّحُوا بُكْرَةً وَعَشِيًّا. So he tells them that they should glorify Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala night and day and night, actually, morning and evening. So here, Ashiya wal Ibkar has been replaced by Bukratam wa Ashiya. And he himself is now telling the people, whereas in verse of Al Imran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, what's the difference here? Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala told him to keep remembering Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he being a prophet goes out to the people and tell him to join him in glorifying Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now it's possible that he spent the night in the mihrab, and when he came out, it was the morning time. So when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, "Wasabbih bil ashiya wal ibkar," it was the night part that he was in the temple. And when he came out to the people, it was early morning, or it was about to be morning. So he tells them bukrata, morning and evening. So again, there is no contradiction in the verses of the Quran. It's simply one has to develop the ability of tangential thinking, extraordinary thinking, and trying to connect one verse with the other and trying to explain it in such a way that the entire meaning emerges without contradiction. Now, Prophet Yahya alayhi salatu wasalam, we will talk about Zakaria alayhi salam in more detail, but let's look at the verses of the Quran in which Yahya alayhi salatu wasalam is mentioned by name. So what I mentioned earlier was the mention of Zakaria alayhi salatu wasalam by name, not that all his story is mentioned only in those verses. It continues, but his name is mentioned at 7 places in 6 verses. Prophet Yahya alayhi salatu wasalam is mentioned by name 5 times in the Quran. So now, فَنَادَتْهُ الْمَلَائِكَةُ وَهُوَ قَائِمٌ يُصَلِّي فِي الْمِحْرَابِ. It is about Zakaria alayhi salatu wasalam that when he was praying in the mihrab, angels called upon him and told him, "Anna Allah yubashshiruka bi Yahya." Allah is giving you the glad tidings of Yahya. So now again, problem arises that in the earlier verses of Surah Al Imran and Surah Maryam, Allah says Qala. Here it is Malaika. So now we have to again explain these verses that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala did not speak to Zakaria alayhi salatu wasalam directly. He spoke through the angels. Fanadatul Malaika. Now Malaika is plural, which means angels. There is a difference between Gospel, the Injil, and the Quran, and we'll mention it at that when we reach that period, when we reach that point. So, what will be the characteristics of Yahya alayhi salatu wasalam? And these are important. Musaddaqan bi kalimati min Allah wa sayyidan wa hasura wa nabiyyan min as-salihin. We'll explain them in detail. Next part is Surah Maryam. Ya Zakaria, inna nubashshiruka bi ghulamin ismuhu Yahya lam naj'al lahu min qablu samia. We have already mentioned it. The next part is Ya Yahya khudil kitaba bi quwwa wa ataynahu al-hukma sabiyya. We'll explain it in detail, inshallah. But the basic translation is that, O Yahya, hold the book with strength, and we gave him the hukm as a child. We'll explain the word hukm. Surah Al-Anam, as I mentioned already, 4 prophets are mentioned. And Surah 90, which I mentioned, فَاسْتَجَبْنَا لَهُ وَوَهَبْنَا لَهُ يَحْيَى. We responded to his dua, and we gave him the gift of Yahya. Now remember, when Zakaria alayhi salatu wasalam asked the dua, he used the same word, habli, give me a gift. So Allah is saying, we are giving you a gift. وَأَصْلَحْنَا لَهُ زَوْجَهُ. His wife was barren, infertile. She had passed that period of fertility, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala restored her fertility to us. And as medical doctor, I can tell you it's completely possible. And there is a term which I read when I was a medical student in a textbook of gynecology written by Professor Jeff Court. Some of the doctors may recognize Dr. Jeff Court wrote a wonderful book. It was probably one of the best books that I read, single author textbook of gynecology. And he mentioned that women stop their periods, we call it menopause, but it doesn't mean that they can never become pregnant again, because a few ovum can still be left in the ovary, and they may start to ovulate at some point, even without having a menstrual period, and they may become pregnant. And he called it flesh in the pan pregnancy. So biologically, it is not inconceivable, it is not impossible that a woman who had already gone through her menopause can become pregnant again. So there is nothing in the Quran which can be contradicted by science. And then, as I mentioned earlier when I explained, إِنَّهُمْ كَانُوا يُسَارِعُونَ فِي الْخَيْرَاتِ وَيَدْعُونَنَا رَغَبًا وَرَهَبًا وَكَانُوا لَنَا خَاشِعِينَ. We already translated. Now, let's look at it in a little bit more detail. So what does the Quran tell us about Prophet Yahya alayhi salatu wasalam? He was son of Zakaria alayhi salatu wasalam. We know that. He was born in his parents' old age, and the cause was his father's dua. And why was Zakaria alayhi salatu wasalam asking for a son? That question comes. In the Desi culture of India and Pakistan, a person or parents ask for a child, a male child, because he will be their support when they become old. Now they are already old here. They don't have a son. They don't even know how long they will be living. But Zakaria alayhi salatu wasalam is asking for a son. And Quran tells us the reason, which is a very profound reason. And this is what, as parents, we have to think about, that when we have children, we bring them up not because they will be our support when we are old, but for a different reason as well. So he said, "Wa inni khaftul mawaliya." And the translation is, now behold, I'm afraid of what my kinsfolk, al mawali is my relatives, my kinsfolk will do miwarai, after me, which means after I'm gone. Kanat imrati aqira, for my wife has always been barren. Fahabli min ladunka waliya. So bestow then upon me out of your grace the gift of a successor. Successor for what? Our Mufassirin mentioned, and it's very beautifully captured here, فَخَافَهُمْ عَلَى الدِّينِ. He was worried for his religion, the religion of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He was afraid that his relatives أَن يُغَيِّرُوهُ وَيُبَدِّلُوهُ, that they will start making changes and they will change it completely. And we see that what happens when a father is gone, when his children take over, and if they're not righteous, they can destroy his business. Here he's worried about his deen. He's not worried about his business. He didn't have any business. وَأَنْ لَا يُحْسِنُ الْخِلَافَ عَلَىٰ أُمَّتِهِ, that they will not be able to fulfill the requirement of a khilafah on his community. A prophet is like a khalifa, and a prophet's son, he wants a son who will fulfill the responsibility of being a true khalifa of his father. فَطَلَبَ أَقَبَ مِنْ صُلْبِهِ الصَّالِحَ. So he asked Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for a righteous person from his lineage, يَقْتَدِي بِهِ فِي إِحْيَاءِ الدِّينِ, who will be the leader in the revival of religion. So he wants that when he is gone, there is somebody in his place who will continue with the revival of religion, who will be the appropriate leader of the people. And Quran captures it. We'll come back to that. So he mentions, Yaresuni wa yaresu min ale Yaquba waj'alhu rabbi yadiya. The dua continues that he will inherit me and he will inherit from the posterity of Yaqub alayhi salatu wasalam, and make him, O my Lord, one with whom thou art well pleased. So now there is a hadith of the Prophet ﷺ that Anbiya do not live behind any worldly property. Their inheritance is the knowledge which they live behind. And here the knowledge of Yahya or Zakaria alayhi salatu wasalam was the Nabuwa. So I will give you Abdullah Yusuf Ali's explanation. It is true that an heir inherits property, but his higher duty is to represent in everything the personality of him whom he inherits. It is doubtful whether Zakaria alayhi salatu wasalam had any worldly property, but he had character and virtue as a man of God. So this is very important for us as parents, our character and our virtue, which will serve as a role model to our children. And this he wanted to transmit to his heir as his most precious possession. It was almost the most precious possession of the posterity of Yaqub alayhi salatu wasalam. The people around him had fallen away from Allah's message. Could his heir like him try and renew it? So that's Abdullah Yusuf Ali's explanation. Now, Yahya alayhi salatu wasalam was named by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and no one was given this name before. And then I will explain this verse that Allah describes him Musaddiqan bi kalimati min Allah, number 1, wa sayyidam, number 2, wa hasuran, number 3, wa nabiyyan min as-salihin. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling us 4 qualities or 4 functions of Yahya alayhi salatu wasalam. So the first is that who shall confirm the truth of a word from Allah. We'll explain it inshallah. And shall be outstanding among men. The word Sayyid also means the leader of the men. Leader in the matter of religion. Wahasuran, he will be utterly chaste, and a prophet from among the righteous. The explanation from our Mufassirin are Musaddaqan bi kalimati min Allah. He will be confirming the truth of a word from Allah, which means Musaddaqan bi Isa mu'minan bihi, that he will testify that Isa alayhi salatu wasalam is a prophet of Allah, and he will be the first one to believe in Isa alayhi salatu wasalam. It is also qila huwa awwalu man amana bihi mu'minan bi kitabi minhu, that he was the first one who believed in Isa alayhi salatu wasalam, and he believed in the Injil which was given to Isa alayhi salatu wasalam. And the other explanation was summal kitabu kalima, was summiyal kitabu kalima, that by word kalima it means the book or the Injil given to Isa alayhi salatu wasalam. Now, what's the meaning of the word Sayyid, which is translated by Muhammad Asad as outstanding among men? Sayyid is allazi yasudu qawmahu, a person who leads his people, ay yafuqahum fi sharf, that who excels over them in his nobility. So a leader is not any leader who wins the election through any means. He's somebody who is above and beyond them in terms of his nobility, in his excellence. Well, hasur means allazi la yaqribu nisa hasara. Hasara al-nafsihi ay man'an laha min ash-shahawat. That he will not approach women with illegal desire, basically. Now, this verse also requires some explanation. Ya Yahya khudil kitaba bi quwwa wa atina al-hukma sabiya. That, O Yahya, hold the book with strength, and we gave him the hukum while he was a child. Now I will give you Muhammad Asad's explanatory translation and then explain it. And when the son was born and grew up, he was told. So this is parenthetic. This is not the actual meaning of the verse. The actual meaning starts in red. O Yahya, hold fast unto the divine writ with all thy strength, for we granted him wisdom while he was yet a little boy. Our Mufassirun have disagreed. Some of them said that Yahya alayhi salatu wasalam was given the Nubuwa when he was a child and he was given a book. But majority also mentioned that by book it is mentioned Torah, because when Yahya alayhi salatu wasalam was born and he was growing up, Isa alayhi salatu wasalam had not been given the Injil at that time. So the book which both of them followed was the Torah. And hukum has been explained in different ways. One meaning is hikmah, another meaning, as I mentioned, is nabuwa. Another meaning is al-fahm lit-Torah wal-fiqh fi-din, that understanding of the Torah and a deeper understanding of the religion, which is the opinion of Ibn Abbas radiyallahu ta'ala anhuma. Ma'amar mentions al-hikmah means al-aql, intellect, waqil an-nabuwa, and it is also mentioned that it may be nabuwa. لأن الله تعالى أحكم عقله في سباه وأوحى إليه. And the reason they say nabuwa is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave him the aql while he was a child and gave him the wahi. So there are different ways of explaining it. Now, another quality, wahana min ladunna. And this is important. The word Hanan is important because Hanan and John are phonetically quite similar. And we'll discuss that in more detail, inshallah, when we talk about what the Bible says about Yahya alayhi salatu wasalam. We may not be able to reach that today, but inshallah we'll discuss. So he was wahanana min ladunna, as well as by our grace. He had the gift of compassion. So compassion is something that comes from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We have hardness of heart. We should always ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to take away the hardness of our heart and make us more and more compassionate. Zakat means purity, wakana taqiyya, and he was always conscious of us. He was muttaqi. Next qualities, wabarram biwalidehi. He was nice to his parents. Walam yakun jabbaran asiya. And he was never haughty or rebellious. We can use it in the context of, in a general context, that he was never arrogant, he was never rebellious against his people. But we can also say that he was never too proud to serve his parents, and he was never disobedient of them. So there is another explanation. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is sending salam upon him the day he was salamun alayhi yawma wulida, the day he was born, wa yawma yamutu, and the day he will die, and wa yawma yub'asu hayya, and the day he will be resurrected again. There is a beautiful story mentioned in some of our tafasir. The similar verse comes in the context of Isa alayhi salatu wasalam, where he said, "Wasalamun alayhi yawma wulidtu wa yawma amutu wa yawma ub'asu hayya." Peace upon me the day I was born, and the day I will die, and the day I will be raised again. And then Isa alayhi salatu wasalam tells Yahya alayhi salatu wasalam that you are better than I am. This is the humbleness of a prophet. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said these words about you, which I am saying about me. So if Allah has said, then you are better. Again, as I said, this is the humbleness of one prophet towards another one. Now, we'll talk about an overview of or a brief introduction to the New Testament. And again, this is only for academic purposes. We are living in an environment where our neighbors, our colleagues, our friends can be Jews and Christians. We engage in interfaith. They visit all our masajid. They invite us to their churches and synagogues. They ask us to give talk in their places. So I think we need to learn something so that we can engage in what Quran says, وَتَعَالُوا إِلَىٰ كَلِمَةٍ سَوَاءٍ بَيْنَنَا وَبَيْنَكُمْ, that come to what is common between you and us. So now the current Bible is called King James Bible, and it was authorized by King James I in the very beginning of the 17th century. It consists of Old Testament, which is basically the Jewish scriptures, including the Torah. We will discuss that, inshallah, next week. And the New Testament, which will be discussed today, which is the Christian scriptures. According to the Christian scholars, the Old Testament, which is basically given to Musa alayhi salatu wasalam and the prophets who came afterwards, is actually prophesying the coming of Christ or coming of Isa alayhi salatu wasalam. So they believe in it only in that context, and they try to explain whatever is written in the Old Testament as a prophecy of the coming of Isa alayhi salatu wasalam. Again, Muslim view is different. Now, this was first translated from what's called Textus Receptus, which is all edition of the Greek text, and there were hundreds of Greek texts. However, the majority of the book of Revelation, which is the last book, seems to have been translated from the Latin version. The King James Old Testament was translated from the Masoretic Hebrew text, and the Apocrypha was translated from the Greek Septuagint, which is 7 books. So actually, there's a lot of academics over here, which I have not gone into the detail, but just to give you that we do not have the original version of these texts. Some of them were translated from Greek, some of them were translated from Latin, some from Hebrew. So it's all here and there. And several versions of the King James Bible were produced over several years. And it's the 1769 edition, which is the most commonly cited now as the King James Version of the Bible. Now, this is a brief layout of the New Testament. When I discussed the Quran, I told you that the Quran is divided into ayah, ruku, and surah. The ruku is, again, not everybody believes in that, but ayah and surah, there is no disagreement among scholars. The concept of ruku is mostly in India and Pakistan, but it has been going on for 1,000 years or even more than that. Now the layout of the New Testament is that first it consists of 4 Gospels, which are basically the memoirs of what Isa alayhi salatu wasalam, who Isa alayhi salatu wasalam was, and you can say his hadith, what he said, and the history. And there are 4 Gospels which are currently in the New Testament. There were more than 100, but only 4 were chosen. Maybe 1,000 years ago, there is a mention of Council of Nicaea that when Constantine turned from, who was a Roman emperor turned from agnosticism or atheism, whatever he was, paganism, to Christianity, he called for a council, and at that council, only 4 Gospels were included. The historicity of this incident, although it's very famous, has been questioned. So these books are Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. We'll discuss them in a little bit more detail. Then comes the Acts, or the Acts of the Apostles, which is written by the same person who wrote the Gospel of Luke, and he was not a Hawari or disciple of Isa alayhi salatu wasalam. Now, the word disciple and apostles, we have to understand them. The disciple is very close in meaning to the Hawariyun mentioned in the Quran, that these were the companions, or you can say Sahaba of Isa alayhi salatu wasalam. Majority of scholars mention that there were 12. There is a minor opinion that there were 14. Now, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were not the disciples of Isa alayhi salatu wasalam. This is a misconception which many Christians have, but it is not actually true. And the Christian scholars of Bible know this. The apostles are it's not in the same sense as Nabi. The apostles were actually the church leaders who were messengers of Isa alayhi salatu wasalam. In a sense, they never met with Isa alayhi salatu wasalam. The most leading apostle was Paul, who was actually a Jew. His name was Saul. He was an enemy of the early Christians. He never met with Isa alayhi salatu wasalam. And then he described that one day he was struck by lightning, and in a dream he saw that Isa alayhi salatu wasalam revealed himself to him, and he became a Christian. And he is the one who actually introduced Trinity. Now, the next part is the epistles, which are actually letters. These are 21 books written by different authors. And if you listen to the academic Christian scholars, they will tell you that there is no certainty that these letters were written by the people to whom they are attributed. And they're actually 21 books. And the last one is called the Apocalypse, which is the culmination of Christianity. It is one book and it's the revelation of John. We don't know who this John was. And it actually talks about the end of the times. So these are basically 27 books of the New Testament. Four of these are called the Gospel, and we will look at them a little bit briefly. Now, so 27 books which were initially written in Greek by 15 or 16 different authors between the years 50 and 120. The non-Muslim Orientalists and other scholars mention that Quran was compiled 200 years after the Prophet ﷺ. And look at our gospel, it was compiled only 40 or 50 years after Isa ﷺ. But if you look at it in detail, you can simply throw this nonsense. Quran, we have evidence. It was collected during the time of Abu Bakr radiallahu ta'ala anhu and Usman radiallahu ta'ala anhu. And there are many Orientalists who tried their best to prove that this is not true. And eventually they say that in the absence of any solid evidence, we'll have to accept the traditional Muslim view. So they have to accept it. But we know, and they know, the Christian scholars know, that these books were written not by one individual, by several individuals. They were written over a period of at least 70 years, if not 100 years, and they differ from each other. It is difficult to know whether any of these books were written by Isa ﷺ's disciples. The four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, we don't know. They carry the name of these people, but it's not certain they were written by these four people. The Act of Apostles was probably written by the same author who wrote the Gospel of Luke. He was actually a traveling companion of Paul. You can say he was secretary of Paul. He never met Isa ﷺ. The 21 letters or epistles written by Paul and other Christian leaders, again, there is no authenticity who actually wrote them. They were actually scribed. So apparently Paul wrote a letter sent to a church. Somebody copied his letter and sent to another church. Then somebody else copied, sent to another church. And while they were copying, they were either adding, deleting, copying, pasting, changing. So we are not sure how authentic those letters are. The last one is the book of Revelation, which is written by someone named John. Someone, so we even don't know historically who that John was, who described the events leading up to the destruction of this world and the appearance of the world to come. But again, as I said, we don't even know who that person John was. The letters of Paul are earliest surviving materials of Christianity. Now, I attended a course on New Testament given by Professor Del Martin. It's an open course given by the Yale University. And he mentioned, as well as another scholar whose name I will mention, Bart Ehrman, that most Christians think that the Gospels are the earliest material of Christianity, which is not historically true. The earliest are the letters of Paul. And although the four Gospels come first in the Testament, they are put first, they were actually written 20 to 40 years after the letters of Paul. So how much influence letters of Paul had upon those books is anybody's guess. And as I mentioned, this will be surprising to some Christians. I just wrote some very cautiously, but I wanted to write to majority of Christians, but I just wrote some. Now, not all letters are considered by academic scholars to be written by Paul. Luke was his traveling companion and not a disciple of Isa ﷺ. He was not among the Hawariyun. And whatever Paul wrote did not come from Gospels because they were not even written at that time. And again, this is a misconception. I will use the word some among some Christians, that they think that the Gospels were written first and what Paul was writing was actually based upon the Gospels. So this is true from Isa ﷺ, and this is not true historically. Now, Professor Del Martin's book, he has written a book, New Testament History and Literature, and he has given a course which I actually attended. It's an online free course. It's available on YouTube as well as on the website of Yale Open University. So Luke was a companion of Paul, but most scholars believe that he did not actually write the Gospel of Luke or the Acts of Apostles. Although again, majority of Christians would believe that the Gospel of Luke and the Acts of Apostles were written by him, but probably not. All four Gospels were originally published anonymously, and the names they now bear were given to the four books later in order to link the books to disciples of Isa alayhi salatu wasalam or close disciples of the disciples of Isa alayhi salatu wasalam. There were more than 100 Gospels, but only four were canonized. And as I mentioned, there is this story, very famous story of the Council of Nicaea in the year 325, that by some miracle, all the Gospels were burnt and only four were left. But the historicity of this event has been questioned. Now, the original text of the New Testament. We Muslims can say with certain confidence that the Quran has not been altered since the time of the Sahaba. This is what it is. But if we look at the original text of the New Testament, Dr. Bart Ehrman is another fantastic professor of Christianity. He's an academic scholar, and he has written several books, including Jesus Misquoted, Jesus Interrupted, and Introduction to the New Testament. He mentions that we do not have the originals of any of the books of the New Testament. The copies we have were made much later, in most instances, many centuries later. And he says we have thousands of these copies in Greek, all of which contain mistakes. And Dr. Ehrman mentions John Mill. He's not the English scholar, the literary figure John Mill, who was a philosopher, but some other John Mill in the current century, actually, the last century, who studied it for about 20 or 30 years, these copies. And he mentioned that there are about 30,000 places where there were differences among the manuscripts. Now, the Orientalists have been studying the different manuscripts of the Quran in different libraries of the world, and they have not found any differences. Quran is what it is. But here, 30,000 differences between hundreds of manuscripts or thousands of manuscripts which have been found in different libraries in Greek. So he poses this question in his book, Introduction to the New Testament, and I'm just quoting him. Do we actually have the original writings of the New Testament? The answer may surprise you. He's addressing his Christian audience. The answer may surprise you, but there is no doubt about it. The answer is a resounding no. So this is just for academic purposes. Now, what's the Quranic text and its style? The Quran was compiled in the form of a Mus'haf during the time of Khalifa Abu Bakr radiallahu ta'ala anhu. And Abu Bakr radiallahu ta'ala anhu's caliphate lasted only 2 years and about 3 or 4 months. So like within 2 years of the passing away of the Prophet ﷺ, Quran had already been compiled in the form of a Mus'haf. Not 20 years later, not 40 years later, not 120 years later, or centuries later. The text was fixed in writing during the caliphate of Usman radiallahu ta'ala anhu, and Usman radiallahu ta'ala anhu did something fantastic. There were other Sahaba at that time, including Ubay bin Ka'b radiallahu ta'ala anhu and Abdullah bin Masud radiallahu ta'ala anhu. They had their own Mus'haf. It doesn't mean that they were something different. They had received the revelation from the Prophet ﷺ. They had written down the Quran in his presence. They had recited to him, but they had their own masahib. They were carrying with it. And then there were people in Kufa and other places who were copying, and sometimes they were copying in their own dialect. So what Usman radiallahu ta'ala did was he got the original version, which was with Hafsa radiallahu ta'ala anha. Because after Abu Bakr radiallahu ta'ala passed away, the copy went to Umar radiallahu ta'ala, and after him it went to Hafsa radiallahu ta'ala anha. So Usman took it from her and he had it copied. It's mentioned that there were 4 or 5 versions or manuscripts which were sent to the leading Islamic centers at that time, including Makkah, Medina, Kufa, Basra. And he ordered that all other versions be burnt and destroyed. And since that time, this is the only version of Quran in the entire world. There's no alteration in the text. The Quranic style, which is something very important, is not chronological. So it doesn't start a story from the beginning and continue it to its end, giving all historical details. This is not Quran's purpose. So Quran's narrative is not focused on the historical details, but on the lessons learned. A couple of years ago, we had an interfaith event at ICW, and we discussed the story of Yusuf alayhi salatu wasalam from Torah as well as from Quran. And one of the Jewish rabbi, Rachel Gerwich, mentioned, and I might have mentioned before that this was the first time studied the Quran. She studied the surah from the Quran, English translation. And then she made another comment. And she says, which is very relevant to what I mentioned, the Quranic narrative is not focused on historical details, but on the lessons learned. She said that the message, that the lesson that we can learn from this surah, the story of Yusuf alayhi salatu wasalam, is very obvious in the Quran. It's there. But she said when we read it in Torah, we actually have to tease it out. Because the way Torah has been written by different scribes afterwards, I'm not saying it was not revealed by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Allah revealed the Torah, but there was a redaction of Torah. We'll discuss it inshallah next week, where through the centuries, people tried to add things and do tahrif and so forth, which Quran also mentioned, that all we have now looks most likely a historical detail. But in between these lines, people can actually get out the lessons. But on the other end, the message of the Quran is very clear to anybody who reads it. And a Jewish rabbi, by just reading it, was able to kind of pinpoint the main difference between the Quranic account of Yusuf alayhi salatu wasalam and the account in the current Torah. I think that I will end at this point because we may be going over time. There's actually a lot to discuss about what the New Testament says about Zakaria alayhi salatu wasalam and Yahya alayhi salatu wasalam. So inshallah, we'll discuss it next week in a little bit more detail. And then we'll continue the Surah Maryam, where the story of Maryam alayhi salatu wasalam resumes. أقول قولي هذا واستغفر الله لي ولكم ولذكر الله أكبر. الصلاة والسلام على رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم. And assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.